My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses. Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
And then, this episode would be great if it would have been a great episode to also do one of those episodes where we revisit an older episode of the podcast. Maybe we should follow it up with that. What do you think? Thematically, I think it fits.
Yeah, well, you're presuming this podcast will still be going on in 20 years, or that we should bring it back in 20 years.
I mean, I'm willing if you are.
Well, that's an interesting idea. But good news, there are no Dooms delays. Nothing,
hey!
At least none that are relevant to us. I think there was a horror movie that had its release date changed, but I don't care about horror movies, so.
Wow. We're really not giving any love to those.
Well, I think it was something about The Conjuring or something. Some movie got its release date moved closer into June, so good news for people who like
that
horror
doesn't
movies.
Sound that interesting.
I'm more interested in just talking about this specific topic because I've observed in the last couple years now this kind of resurgence of franchises coming back after many decades of being away.
And you're not the only one, I'm sure.
Yeah, we've talked on this show before about nostalgia and franchises and how there's no original ideas in Hollywood. But, I think there's something to be said about these specific kind of movies. So, and this might include TV shows as well. So the idea here is talking about sequels that were made decades after the original. And I've tried to come up with some rules to kind of funnel the list down so that we're being very pointed in what we discuss. And I'm going to be looking to you to kind of vet these rules, see if they make sense.
I love the good rule of vetting on this podcast.
So the first rule I came up with was that the sequel has to have been made at least 20 years after the original.
How much of a stickler are we being for that?
If it
was released in 2020, then it's okay. If it was released in 2001, even if it was later in the year than we currently are we still counting that?
Yeah, so here's my thinking is that, I don't know, it is kind of a stickler between 19 and 20 or 21, but the way I was thinking is 20 years, that's multiple decades.
Right.
Anything less than 20 years is still, I guess, a long time for people, but it doesn't mark the passage of time in the same way that 20 does. That's literally that's where it borders on generational, where somebody who would have seen the first film possibly as a child or a teenager could be a parent by the time the sequel comes out.
Okay. I think we can get behind that. So we're not being sticklers for that one, but it's at least that long because otherwise it makes less sense.
Yeah, so this means this is going to exclude certain films like Blues Brothers 2000 or Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which came out 19 years after the last Indiana Jones movie. So we won't be discussing that today. And that's and we're going to be clear, this is 20 years from the last movie. So it doesn't necessarily mean that's it doesn't mean movie one and then at least 20 years later there was movie two. We're willing to accept franchises that return. So again, looking at Indiana Jones, the first film came out in 1981. So you could say, yeah, there's more than 20 years between the first one and the fourth one, but the third Indiana Jones came out in 1989, and the fourth one came out in 2008. So it's 19 years, which means it is not far enough apart for our conversation. So we're not talking about Crystal Skulls today.
All right. Well, I mean, I'm always game for not talking about Crystal Skull anyway, so I think it's a fair rule, yeah.
All right, my second rule. At least one person from the original production has to be involved. Now, this could be an actor, it could be a producer, it could be a writer, it could be the director.
Does that disqualify Ghostbusters?
Well, and that kind of actually that'll come up in my next rule. But this is why
we want to disqualify Ghostbusters. We're going to make a rule specifically for it.
Well, no. So why I think this is important is that I think of a movie like Bambi 2, like the direct-to-video Disney sequel that was made to Bambi. It was made many decade, like 40 or 50 years after the original, but absolutely nobody who was involved with the original film was even, I don't know if anyone was even still alive. Maybe there were, I don't know. But in my mind, it's not a real sequel. It feels more like a spin-off, I guess, if none of like the original cast or any of the original creative team were involved. Like there was a TV movie version of The Birds too. Like they made a sequel to The Birds, but literally the only person from the original that was involved was one of the actresses, and she played a different character. So it wasn't even, I don't know. Does that make sense?
I suppose, but is it going to be like, I don't know, like, but if they so they'd have to reprise whatever role they had?
If it's an actor, yes, but like for example, Dr. Sleep, the movie that came out in 2019, is meant to be a sequel to The Shining, but no one like from the cast of the original film comes back, and no one from behind the scenes comes back.
What if it was something like I'm just so we get this? What if it was something like, you know, one of the actors became the director for the next one, or like one of the actors was involved in the production, but not in the same way they were?
I'd be happy to.
Like if an actor became an executive producer, it'd be okay.
Yeah.
All
I don't know if there's many cases of that, but
I feel like there's a few.
Yeah, and maybe they don't fall into the 20-year gap. Like, you know, you think of like the Creed movies. There's not 20 years between Rocky Balboa from 2006 and Creed, which came out.
Oh yeah, that's true. I forgot about Rocky Balboa.
And so did a lot of people. So yeah, like unfortunately we won't be talking about those movies either. And yeah, Dr. Sleep we won't be talking about. So this should narrow it down to actually, because then it feels like a real sequel if at least somebody from the original production is still involved, you know?
Yeah, or at least a continuation.
So I believe this also disqualifies Fantasia 2000, which came out almost 60 years after the original. I don't believe anybody who was involved with it. I mean, if you count Mickey Mouse as a character, that's a bit of a stretch.
I don't know. I'd honestly be surprised that nobody at all was involved.
All right. Well, we won't look it up. We'll just assume they were, and we'll mention them later.
All right.
This would also exclude things like Space Jam: A New Legacy. I looked at like the cast and the production team. Like no one from the original Space Jam, even though it was only 25 years ago, is involved with the making of this one. Technically, like Warner Brothers as the production company is the same, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, that does make it a little bit more interesting. Yeah, you've looked at voice actors too?
I did. Yeah, they don't. Well,
really?
Okay, there
was
is
Mel
technically
Blanc still alive.
No, he died many years ago.
So.
But I think the guy who plays Porky Pig is still the same, so we can count them in for the sake of him.
I think we can't look. Porky Pig is a very difficult voice to do.
Okay, fine. We'll keep that in. And then my third rule, which is the one I don't know why I'm being so particular about, but in my mind, we can't count a movie as a sequel that has been made decades later if there has been some kind of spin-off or remake done in the intervening years, because that means that the gap in time has been filled by something. And so this is where 2016 Ghostbusters kind of comes in.
Or Alien versus Predator, Alien versus Hunter, and all those kind of things.
Yeah, because in my mind, it's not a real decades later sequel if there was something that came along in the in-between time to try and fill the void.
So we're looking for something that was forgotten and then brought back, more or less.
Well, yeah, we'll get into the reasons why these sequels come out, but this would exclude things like Cobra Kai, which breaks my heart because I'd love to talk about Cobra Kai in this episode, but technically because the Karate Kid remake movie came out in 2010.
I mean, there were also the sequels to Karate Kid,
but
there were a
I
few
checked
of
it.
them.
The next Karate Kid, which was the last one, came out in 1994. So there is at least 20 years between that and the first season of Cobra Kai. But by my being particular about excluding remakes, then it has to exclude Cobra Kai.
But was somebody involved in the remake that was involved in the original?
No.
Okay.
Not that I know of.
No, that's fair. Like I'm still okay with that rule. I was just trying to think if where somebody might try to be a stickler for that. But it is true though that at least somebody was thinking about it.
Yeah, and even something like Star Trek Picard that just started in 2020. Technically, there were 26 years between the end of Star Trek: The Next Generation and Star Trek Picard, but there were movies that came out in between that where like Patrick Stewart was playing the part, and of course there's all kinds of Star Trek content that's come out that fill that gap. So they're really I guess I see like something like Star Trek Picard is not necessarily a decades later sequel in the purest sense because Star Trek as a brand has had a lot of different things going on. I also wasn't sure what this meant for the Star Wars Disney sequel trilogy because, again, if I'm being a technical person here, like you could consider the prequels as like a spin-off of the original or a continuation of the series. So we couldn't consider.
I mean, there's been the 2 Clone Wars animated, and there were a number of things in between as well.
Okay, so you're okay with rule number 3?
Oh yeah, and those ones George Lucas was all involved in.
That's
in
true.
some
Okay.
capacity.
All right, so we're going to orient ourselves. We're going to just repeat the rules of the case. Number 1, it has to have been at least 20 years since the last installment of the franchise. Number 2, at least one person has to have been involved with the original and the follow-up. And number 3, there can't have been any spin-offs or remakes done in the gap between entries in the franchise. So there's probably a lot of movies or shows you're thinking about that, like X-Files, for example, that they just don't fit the rules. So we're just going to have to not talk about them today.
I like it.
So talking about this idea of the decades later sequel, Beef Pork Ribs, why do you think it takes so long for some of these movies to get released?
I think there's a few different reasons. I think some of it probably has to do with the people who actually enjoyed them when they first came out get older, and they're the ones who are in charge of them, because I feel like that's something that happens quite a decent amount, is just people people have always wanted to do this, but they weren't able to get it off the ground, or it wasn't popular enough when it came out, but then it got a cult following later on, which changed people's minds about it. I think that's probably one of those. The other one, though, I do think that there's recently just been this weird 80s nostalgia that's just kicking in, which has to do with successful things like Stranger Things, for example, that were 80s nostalgia because it was people who were kids in the 80s now are in a position. I guess it's a similar thing, right? That there is just, as you said, it is almost generational, and I think it is that's the thing. It's the generation that first enjoyed these is coming back, or is in a role or now find themselves in roles where they can make a difference, right? And I think that's probably what we're looking at, is just these people that didn't, for a long time, weren't able to do things, but now are, and therefore are kind of not abusing, but using that to be able to make something that they've always wanted to do and they think is worthwhile.
And I actually prefer this idea of like a generational sequel than a remake. Like I appreciate it when, and we'll talk about with some of these movies, this idea of introducing a concept to the next generation by kind of organically continuing the story from the film that the previous generation knew, in my mind, is a much better way of going about telling one of these stories than to simply like do a remake or a reimagining of the same film. Like Lion King
I mean,
2019.
I can understand the reimagining as well, because because the reimagining also can allow you to take the basic story structure and apply it in a way that people will understand. It's the kind of thing that, like, when it's done properly is very good, but also can be done poor. Like the general idea behind Romeo plus Juliet, it was supposed to be this remake of a Shakespearean play, but like really nobody wanted that. Shakespeare in the context of like street gangs, and you've seen the movie, right? You know what I'm talking
No,
about?
I know what you're talking about, but I have not watched it.
Okay, well, it's just to sometimes people are just trying to make a sequel for the sake of making money, or they're trying to make it. Sorry, that's not the problem. The problem is they're trying to make it more relevant to people nowadays, but they're not keeping. They're either making it so far out of place that it doesn't make any sense, or they're adding too much of the modern thing in it, and it just causes a problem. I think something like, even though it wasn't a remake, something like Raya and the amount of like slang there was in it, and like it's Raya, it's not going to age well. It is very dated, but in a weird way without being set in the time, which kind of justifies it. Like something that is very of its time and that will be dated because of the references in it are current is one thing, but something that's dated just because they used a different language to try to be more open to the new generation, that can cause a lot of problems.
I feel like you were just saying when we talked about Raya that it was going to age a lot better than something like Tom and Jerry. Is your tune changing on us? Are you turning your back on Raya?
Um, not entirely. I'm
Like a
not.
side turn?
Yeah, maybe a bit of a side turn, but it's mostly that, like, I do think Raya is going to age better than Tom and Jerry, but I also do think that some parts of it are not going to age as well, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but people, I think, will be looking at that movie and being like, "Oh wow, that was so, 2020s," even though nothing in the movie has to do with our current decade, but the slang in it and the sense of humor definitely do.
So, researching this subject of decades later sequels, I discovered that most of these movies came out as late as they did due to some kind of delay. Either actors didn't want to come back, or people who owned the rights to the idea didn't want a sequel to be made, or there were budgetary issues. I know at least for some of these movies, things like 9/11 happening kind of delayed their productions even more. So there's all kinds of reasons why one of these sequels might take a while to make. There's at least a couple anecdotes with the movies we'll discuss that I thought were quite interesting. But this is a much less common thing with TV shows. I've found, like, looking up TV shows that kind of fit this criteria of being gone for 20 years and coming back. There's really only a handful of them that kind of fit the bill. And Fuller House is the first one I can really see kind of capturing this idea of the decades later sequel. It started on Netflix 21 years after the final season of Full House. And I think in the time since then, more and more TV shows have kind of jumped on this idea to varying levels of success. Like Animaniacs has had a revival with none of the original producers, but a lot of the original cast. Saved by the Bell has a new version on Peacock. Roseanne, of course, came back famously for one season and then turned into a different show. Murphy Brown came back for like one season 20 years later. That Magic School Bus Rides Again thing was a thing that went on for a few years. So this has happened with TV, but it's not nearly as, I guess, noteworthy as it is with movies.
But I think it's also, the TV industry is very different from the movie industry. Like, what is like ratings are so important, and like riding hype and being in the moment, like, you know what I mean? There's a lot more to TV shows and to trying to keep them going than there is a movie, I think. And I think that's probably why you get more of those movies that are that don't have that. More TV shows that don't happen immediately isn't so much because of somebody didn't want to do it, but because what was on TV 20 years ago is very, very different than what's on TV now. Whereas for movies, I do see it because I do remember, like, even just this isn't like a decades later, but like how after the third Bourne movie, Matt Damon said he wouldn't return to the role unless there was something good, or something we will probably talk about, but Blade Runner. There were a lot of interviews where people asked, Harrison Ford why he took so long, and he either said he was, um, waiting for one of the actors to be there, but most of the time he said he was waiting for the right script and wouldn't touch it otherwise. And I think that's often the case, and also often, but I think more often than not, like, this will be the case when it's one of the good sequels and not the like cash grab nostalgia ones, if you know what I mean. Like,
Yeah,
when something has more of the original people, it's because they wanted to do it now and they've gotten either technology or an idea or a script or something that they didn't have before.
and as we talk about these, not too many of these films were successful. So this idea of doing a sequel more than 20 years with original cast or crew and with no spin-offs or prequels or remakes in the middle, it's a questionable idea. And we're going to give these movies back cookies and noogies as we go along. So the first film I could find, like chronologically, like this would have been the first example of this kind of movie. The first film I could find was Psycho 2, which came out in 1983, a whopping 23 years after the original Psycho. And the same guy, I think his name's Anthony Perkins, plays, oh man,
Yeah.
what's that serial killer's name? Or is he considered a serial killer? Norman Bates.
Norman Bates. I mean, he did kill more than 3 people with an MO, so yeah, he is a serial killer.
I've never seen this. I've seen the original Psycho, but I didn't even know this film existed until this week.
Haha! Clearly, your wife is not a huge movie nerd, who loves Norman Bates. Mjolnir is a big fan of the original and of Norman Bates, the character as a whole. I have not seen it either, but I knew it existed a long time ago because of that, and it's a weird one to go up, because my understanding of it is that the purpose of it was to kind of explore his character a bit more, like Norman Bates's character specifically, rather than just have like, basically, and that's where I think it falls into a similar situation of the, like, they were waiting for something, or I think in this case something happened because, like, the understanding of mental health issues keeps advancing and advancing. And when the first one came out, like, a lot of people, and I know this is something people do look at Psycho a lot and like, wow, they had no idea what, being bipolar was, or being, having any kind of like mental health issues was like, and they just invented the mental issue a little bit, like, in Hollywood, autism is just used as this kind of like catch-all for when you want to make somebody special, but you're not sure what to say. And so I'm going to go with Bat Cookie for that one, because it was kind of more of the actor's passion project. And from what I heard, like, it's not nearly as good, but, you're trying to compare Hitchcock to not Hitchcock. It's a little bit harder to do.
I hear that the original author of Psycho actually wrote a sequel that was received very poorly, and this movie intentionally didn't adapt the book. So just purely based on the fact that Psycho 2, the movie, is better than Psycho 2, the book, I'll also give it a Bat Cookie.
Yeah, I think that's an appropriate response.
Now, for the rest of the movies I've found that fit within these 3 points of criteria, we're going to go kind of talking by longest gap between entries in the franchise. So if we do consider Fantasia 2 a true sequel in the sense that we'll assume at least someone from the production side of Disney was involved with both, there were essentially 60 years between the first one and the second one.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I think Fantasia should be considered is because Fantasia wasn't just, one person's project, right? It wasn't just Walt Disney who was like, oh, I want to do this. I mean, it partially was, but it was like the way the second one worked was an homage to that idea and to the spectacle that was kind of working there. And I think like at least the spirit of it was quite alive in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I couldn't bring myself to watch it. I didn't enjoy the first one, so I'm going to give it a bat nuggy.
Oh, I definitely give it a bad cookie. I enjoy it quite a lot. It is not on the same level as the first one. There are certain things that happen in it that are not... Like, it's not the same level of artistry overall, but I feel like the better pieces of Fantasia 2000 are just as good as the better pieces of the first Fantasia. It's just some of them are weaker.
Mary Poppins Returns came out 54 years after the original Mary Poppins movie, and because Dick Van Dyke is in both movies, it fits the criteria for...
I was wondering how you got that one in, but you're right. Oh, bad cookie on that one. It was a little uncanny, a little strange, but I did like it quite a bit. And I also know a lot of other people who absolutely love the movie. And the thing is also, I think most of the people who love the movie are people who loved the books. And that tends to be pretty nice.
Yeah, I mean, it was so successful that Disney, of course, wanted to make another one, but P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins, hated the Disney approach to her books. So they basically had to wait until she was dead, and then they waited years before approaching her estate about the idea of doing another film.
Yeah, which I think was a good move on their part, because of just how much trouble there was between Disney and the estate too for a while.
Yeah, if people want to hear more about this specific movie, we did an episode on it when it came out a few years ago. So I think I gave it a bad cookie.
Did we do an episode on Saving Mr. Banks as well?
We have not actually done that yet.
Well, check out that as well if you are interested in the issue too.
I'll give Mary Poppins Returns a bad cookie. Why not? Admittedly, 54 years between entries in a franchise is a long time. So most of the films, it's closer to a more reasonable time period. So next up, Blade Runner 2049 came out 35 years after the original.
And I shamefully have still not seen it.
Really?
Yeah,
beef pork ribs.
I know. There are a few movies that have just been on my list forever, and that's one of them. I do want to see it. I did very much enjoy the first one.
A French Canadian directed it.
Well, yes, I know. Look, he's been hit and miss on his movies. They've been overall pretty good, but some of them have been... he's very good when it comes to his own style and keeping to that, but outside of it...
You know he's the one directing the new Dune, right?
Yes, I am fully aware of that. I had a very long conversation with a friend about that exact issue at some point, which is also part of why it's one of those. It gets me excited for the new Dune in some ways, but also keeps me cautiously optimistic, because if the Dune is closer to his other movies, it won't be the Dune that I want, but it could still be a very good Dune movie.
Well, I saw Blade Runner 2049 when it came out, and the fact that movie was coming out actually made me watch the original Blade Runner, because I had never seen it. I'd heard about it. So the fact that the sequel came out made me want to watch the original so I'd understand what was going on, and we ended up covering both movies on the podcast. And you know what? This was a cult classic for sure. It was not received well or didn't make money when it came out, so that's a big reason why it took so long for a sequel to come around. And you know what?
But also, Harrison Ford did not want to make a sequel.
No, he did not. But yeah, it. I was disappointed to see how poorly the film did. Like, it was received well by critics and it got an Oscar for its cinematography, but it did not make bank at the box office. And I was disappointed by that because I thought it was a very good kind of follow up to the story that was told in the first film.
Yeah, I mean, I'll from what I've heard, not just from you right now, but like I'd still give it a bat cookie. I, I also I don't know. The first one had a little bit of that issue too. Like, not so much for the commercial success. It did fairly well, as I recall, but it is not your traditional like movie. And even at that time, a neo noir was not a big money getter. You know?
So I'll give it a bat cookie for sure.
Yeah, bat cookie.
Coming to America came out 33 years after the original. It was, of course, supposed to come out last year, so it got an extra year added onto it for its release in 2021. I have yet to watch it, even though I was like so excited for it, and I don't know what that says. I guess I'm just not big enough of a fan. I'm sure it'll be worth my while when I eventually watch it. This was another case where Eddie Murphy, was only willing to do a sequel when the right kind of script option came along. So the fact that this was,
I think that still remains to be seen if it was, but I'll give it a temporary
sensation.
bad cookie. Sensation bad cookie, yeah.
Yeah, for the fact that I haven't actually like sat down and watched it yet, I got to give it a sensation bad cookie. Mad Max Fury Road came out 30 years after the previous installment in the Mad Max series. I have yet to watch this. I've heard lots of good things about it.
My gosh, it gets the biggest bad cookie. It is an amazing movie oh, yeah, no. I love Fury Road. I had watched in anticipation for Fury Road because I heard it was good. I had watched at that point. I'd watched Thunderdome a while back, and it didn't seem to make much sense, but I watched it because it was supposed to be a classic. And then I watched the other ones, and it made Thunderdome make more sense. It's not the same story, definitely, but also because of what caused the first movie and why people were trying to looking at making it. I think it is a very good sequel, both in on the technical side and on the story side. I think it works very well, but I think what's best is that Fury Road still works as a standalone film. You don't have to know the other movies, but if you do, there's a few things that you'll recognize and that are still quite enjoyable.
Yeah, and it's the same director coming back to the series.
Gosh. And I can see because and that is the thing, the original Mad Max kind of got some applauses for using technical physical effects, rather than special effects for a lot of the stunts, and it shows, and it is something Fury Road definitely decided was going to be a good idea to follow up on.
Yeah, I've heard people say it's the best in the whole Mad Max series, which for being a decades later sequel, that seems to be of high praise, considering...
I think that's probably accurate, actually.
Yeah, and it was received well critically and commercially, so I know they're doing a prequel now about a younger Furiosa, and that's kind of how this series seems to be continuing, but back cookie for me.
Yeah. I think it could still work, but the prequel, that is, but I'm skeptical about it. But yes, bad cookie. 100%.
Bill and Ted Face the Music came out 29 years after the second Bill and Ted movie. So we've talked about this. I enjoy it. It's the only Bill and Ted movie I've actually seen. And it was one of the ones, it's another one of these cases where a cult classic took a long time for people to be interested in it, and the right idea came along.
I mean, I think it was more Keanu Reeves becoming big again than the right idea, but still, bat cookie for sure. I think I talked about it enough on the episode.
Yeah, I'll give it a bat cookie. All right. This is an interesting movie. So this is The Odd Couple 2. So I'd never even heard of The Odd Couple, but apparently, in the late 1960s, they this movie called The Odd Couple, which was a Broadway play that was turned into a movie. Is I guess two male roommates who just don't clash or sorry, they do clash with each other. They don't get along, and it was a comedy. And then they brought these same actors back 29 years later to reprise their roles, and I guess it wasn't received well by anybody.
I'm vaguely aware of it, but I don't think I've never seen it. So I'll trust the fact that nobody liked it and give it a bat noogie then.
Yeah, Bat Nuggy. Sorry, guys. Tron Legacy came out 28 years after the original Tron.
I remember not liking Tron Legacy when it came out. Partially because I don't really like Daft Punk,
What?
did not at the time really like Daft Punk or electronica of any kind. But I have rewatched it since. It's still not amazing, though. To be fair, the original Tron, other than the technological, than the actual computer generated graphics, is not that amazing either, and this definitely did better. So yeah, I'll give it a bat cookie. I still think it was overhyped when it came out, but it was definitely good.
This one's a shocker that this actually came to be, because yeah, like the original Tron movie was like this little niche, again, kind of cult classic, I guess you could say. From
I didn't even get an Oscar for best visual effects because they were told that they cheated by using a computer.
Yeah, so I only saw this like 2 years ago. My roommate Professor F convinced me to watch it because he was a fan of it. And having not seen the original, it is one of these decades later sequels that you can just sort of, I guess, pick up and watch without knowing very little about the original. The only thing that was distracting about it is the de-aged Jeff Bridges, and like, God bless them for trying, but in 2010, like the technology just was not there yet to pull off a convincing de-aged look. And it was very distracting whenever that younger Jeff Bridges was on screen.
Yeah, I agree, but it turned out okay, I think. Like,
yeah, critics were kind of even keeled about it, and then it made money, but considering how expensive it was for all the visual effects, it was not enough money for Disney to consider doing a follow-up. So there was like a TV animated series that was like a kind of like set in that world that was done for a few years.
It's a strange thing where like animation is definitely a better place to do a Tron sequel, but at the same time it kind of defeats the purpose of doing a Tron.
Yeah, so I'll give it a Thensation Bad Cookie. The Color of Money, and again, another movie I'd never heard of before, came out 26 years after a film called The Hustler. So The Hustler was this movie that Paul Newman was in 1961, where he was playing essentially a really good pool player. And then in 26 years later, they made a sequel where his character is an older man mentoring Tom Cruise, who's like a young pool shark.
Interesting.
And both of these movies are on Disney Plus. I had meant to like find time to watch them, but it just didn't happen. So this is kind of cool because this is a situation where it's not necessarily a direct sequel, I suppose. It's a continuation of the story, and it takes that generational approach by having the character from the previous film take on a mentor role in the new one. And I feel like this is the kind of movie I appreciate, because you could easily make this movie with just a random guy as the old person, be like, oh yeah, I'm a grizzled veteran, I've done this before. But when it's actually a character who is actually another movie years ago, I feel like it just adds like a level of gravitas to the experience.
Yeah, and it also usually means that, I don't know, like, obviously, if the actor doesn't have exactly the same level of prestige as, Harrison Ford had, it's not necessarily the same thing like some actors. But I feel like when you get to a certain age, even if you're not a successful actor, you still vet the roles that you're willing to take. I feel like that's probably one of those situations. So sounds like fun. I'll give it a Thensation just because I had never heard about it, but it sounds interesting.
Yeah, Thensation Bad Cookie for sure. So Space Jam: A New Legacy, as we mentioned, is coming out this year, 25 years after the original. Apparently, they were interested in doing some kind of follow-up to the original, but Michael Jordan did not want to be involved with it at all, and so they explored ideas of doing movies with different athletes like Tiger Woods or Tony Hawk, and none of those ideas went anywhere, and then they ended up doing Looney Tunes Back in Action instead, and then that kind of killed these live-action animation hybrid movies for a while. So We haven't seen it yet, but the trailer makes it look really cool, and I'm excited for it.
I don't know. The concept of it seems a little strange, especially that it is Space Jam. Like, I feel like I would have been a lot more okay if it would have been a spinoff with some other sports personality or something else, but I think there were reasons Michael Jordan didn't want to do it again, and I think they're probably very good reasons. Pardon me, I've got hiccups here, but I don't know. A lot of people seem excited about it. I'm gonna give it a was it a soft noogie?
Yeah, soft bat noogie.
Yeah, I'll give it a soft bat noogie.
Oh, boo! Big bat cookie from me. And by the way, like if anyone listening to this is having problems with hiccups, number one best solution: drink some lemon juice. It works for me every time.
I just drink something. I just hold my breath and then drink something while hanging upside down.
Fair enough.
I can't do that right now, but usually I do all three of them, and one of them works.
Wall Street: Money Never Sleeps was a sequel that came out 23 years after the original Wall Street. These are both movies I've heard about. They're both on Disney Plus, and I am actually interested in watching them because this is, again, like Wall Street was a movie about like 1980s Wall Street, kind of like stock market sort of stuff, 80s excess, blah blah blah. So it is interesting to like check back on those characters like 2 decades later, kind of like when the housing crisis is happening and whatnot in the United States. Like that would be interesting to see how Gordon Gekko kind of like sees the situation. But I guess when this came out in 2010, I was still like young or just not, because I mean I didn't grow up with the original Wall Street, obviously, so maybe I just wasn't intelligent enough yet to enjoy a movie like this.
I think that has the potential to be a similar to Fury Road kind of thing. I mean, because Fury Road was based on the fuel and energy crisis of because what if we were to run out of gas, and what would happen if we hadn't found more, and because originally Mad Max wasn't supposed to be full on post apocalyptic. It was more like if the world was in crisis, and in a very specific type of crisis. So I think that's an interesting, definitely an interesting concept. And since they weren't just doing, oh, it's Wall Street again, it was like based on another economic problem or situation. I think that's worth exploring and worth doing a sequel about. So Bat Cookie as well.
Well, I haven't given it a cookie
I thought
yet.
you said Bat Cookie. I'm so sorry.
No, but you can give it a cookie. That's fine. What's keeping me from giving this a Bat Cookie is knowing that the film didn't do well when it came out. And I heard one person on YouTube talk about it, and they said that there's a scene where two actors in the original movie are together and yet they have no chemistry, despite having had a lot of good chemistry when the original came out in the 80s. So I was like, okay, like they're, that's weird to think that the same actors years later weren't able to connect on screen with each other the same way they used to. And so that leads me to giving
it. Strange though, because I feel like that happens quite a bit where you have people who did very well in one thing, but by the end of it, they're sick of each other, or, there are different situations where something like that can happen.
Well, for now, I'm going to give it a soft bat noogie. I hope when I do actually watch these that it turns into a cookie. T2 Train Spotting. Not T2 Terminator 2, but T2 Train Spotting came out 21 years after the original Train Spotting. And apparently it's because Ewan McGregor and Danny Boyle, who directed the movie, had like some kind of falling out where they didn't talk to each other for like 10 years. Apparently, I think Ewan McGregor was mad at Danny Boyle because he didn't cast him in a movie that Danny Boyle did, and for some reason he thought he was going to be picked for the role. So this is a case where the sequel came out many years later just because of a dispute between the creatives behind the scenes, and I haven't seen either film, so I actually have no comment on these.
I have not seen them either, but I've generally heard good things about both of them. So I'm going to go with a Thensation Bat Cookie.
You know what? That's fair. I'll throw a Thensation up there as well.
Because Train Spotting, not the second one per se, but Train Spotting is definitely on my list of movies I want to watch.
And I know Mjolnir kind of alluded to us, talking about Dumb and Dumber 2 with TOO, but because there was the prequel spinoff that came out in intervening years, we don't have to talk about it. So hooray. But one terrible movie we have to talk about, unfortunately, coming out 20 years after the original, is Independence Day: Resurgence.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was a thing.
I was so excited to see this because, I was disappointed they couldn't get Will Smith back. Apparently, his filming Suicide Squad prevented him from being able to be in the movie. But I was really excited because, I love Independence Day. It's such a great 90s blockbuster, America kind of movie.
But I feel like that's kind of its undoing for a sequel, is that it is very 90s America. Like, there's a reason a lot of Arnold Schwarzenegger movies haven't gotten sequels. Ever.
A lot of them have, so.
Well, okay, but a lot of them haven't as well, though. They never made a sequel.
So it happens
for
when you make
Commando.
so many movies. It's not all of
No,
them.
I know, but even some of his more iconic ones, like Running Man, Commando. There was a reboot of Total Recall, but it was total crap. So, you know, um,
listen, with this. Okay, so with this Independence Day movie, they had a good idea, like seeing that version of Earth 20 years after aliens attacked, and seeing how like technology had advanced so much because of their contact with the aliens. But the movie was so sequel baity, and the character, like, it just did not capture the same feel. And like, there's even a moment where Bill Pullman's president character is giving a speech, and I'm like, this is like such a sad, whimpering, like, imitation of what you did the first time around. And it did feel like a lot of like, see, remember this thing from the last movie? Like, we're doing it again for you. Please like it.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with, like, who was involved from the original?
Well, Roland Emmerich, the director.
Really?
Jeff Goldblum, Brent Spiner.
Yeah, but Jeff Goldblum will do anything. I am a little bit surprised, I'll be honest, that there were that many people, because I feel like you said, it was an interesting concept, and it definitely was a world that could work with a sequel. But also, I do think, like, it was very 90s action movie. There's a lot of 90s action movie didn't get sequels because they were just so of their time. Just the way that a lot of 80s action movies ended up getting sequels, but by the time they did, it was kind of, too late to do it.
And apparently Roland Emmerich doesn't like doing sequels, and that's partially why even though Independence Day was like the biggest film of that year, there was no interest for him to do another one. And I can't remember what he said, but there was some reason why he came back when he did. And unfortunately, like, the ending is so sequel baity that I'm like, you guys were just, you were, it's it was, it was that time period, 2016. That was like the era of, we got to turn this one movie into like a franchise machine. So instead of just telling a good story, let's set up plot threads and character arcs that will be answered later on.
Yeah, and I think that, only works when it is done when it is done in a way that can be standalone and that is intentional about it. But yeah, it's definitely a bad noogie, but it could have been, I think, at least a sensation, if not a bad cookie. But I think it's not even just the execution; it's also just that. Well, yeah, it is in the execution, but not just like all the things, just the concept that it was a sequel bait. Because again, if you're doing a huge action movie, like 90s like action movies now, that doesn't work anymore. So if you take the same universe and try to do something original with it, great. But if you do anything like the first one, you're going to hit problems.
The biggest bat nugget you can give a movie. That's what Independence Day: Resurgence gets from me.
I guess you like the first Independence Day more than I did. I didn't dislike it, I will say.
Well, based on the research I did prior to this, thinking of our criteria, that kind of is the list of notable movies that are decades later sequels that don't have some kind of remake. There are lots of movies that kind of come close, like in terms of like the timing, or there are films that kind of like fit the criteria if you don't consider that there was some kind of remake. Like Ghostbusters Afterlife, for example, will technically be a decades later sequel, but because they did the 2016 reboot, by what we've kind of determined as our criteria, it kind of cancels it out. So with all this being said, Beef Pork Ribs, like, what do you think is the best movie here in this list?
Oh, wow. Do we have the list on the... Yes, we do. I mean, I think Fury Road is the best movie on this list generally. But I think Mary Poppins Return is the best sequel. Because
Well,
because Mary Poppins was great. Mary Poppins Returns was great. I did not think it was as good a movie, but Mad Max Fury Road does change a lot of the setting and prerequisites of it. Whereas I think Mary Poppins is a more fateful, not only like we were talking about generational sequel, but also sequel.
all right. Well, just to be contrarian, I will give Tron Legacy the best sequel award, and I'm going to give Blade Runner 2049 the best movie award.
Interesting.
So there you have it, folks. Looking at this list of movies and seeing how most of them have not done well, I think this is kind of a sign that generally we shouldn't be trying this. Like, there's certain franchises and characters that people like to see come back, but on the whole, this is not a venture worth going for.
But I think it's also those who do work well are the ones that aren't just because somebody thought that this needed to be seen again. It was when people had an idea that could build on what it was. And I think that also goes into not just decades later, but generally what makes a good sequel. You know what I mean? Like, a good sequel has to be able to build on the themes, be able to add something new, be able to give growth to the characters, and so if a story, and I think a lot of, not necessarily the ones on this list specifically, but a lot of sequels have this problem that it's like there is a closed character arc and then suddenly they decide to try to do something else with it.
So I've written that down as a topic to go inside the bat jar because I'd love to talk more about that. But for
Just
today,
sequel?
this will wrap up our conversation about decades later sequels. Is there one we forgot about? Do you guys disagree with our criteria for what should be a decades later sequel? And we just love to hear from you because we have no mail once again. And for those of you who are listening all the way to the end of the episode here, we'll remind you once again how to get a hold of us.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
Now for next week, we have a choice. Well, we have multiple choices, and I'm going to leave it up to you to decide. We could talk about Falcon and the Winter Soldier, since the final episode comes out next Friday. We could talk about the new Mortal Kombat movie, since it is being released in theaters where people can see it and for digital rental everywhere else. Or we could just pull some out of the bat jar. So, what do you think, Beef Fork Ribs?
Personally, I'd like to talk about Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
All right.
I've been enjoying it quite a bit, more so actually than I did WandaVision. And I think it has things worth talking about.
I agree. Literally, it's as if you read my mind just now, because all the things you just said I agree with. So wonderful.
Great. I also don't want to watch another Mortal Kombat movie.
Oh, okay. Well,
we'll have to eventually, but like if I can put that off as long as possible, I'm gonna do that.
In our house, we've given the Falcon and the Winter Soldier the kind of code name of Snowy Owl.
I like it.
And then that's an attempt, of course, to just give it a shorter title because it is so long. But we promise it'll be a great episode next week.
Friend.
So the series is streaming on Disney Plus. It's only 6 parts as opposed to the 9 that WandaVision had. And each part is closer to an hour. So, if you want to be fully watched up by the time we talk about it next week, you got some homework to do. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
And I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
Are we a 20 years later sequel of our birth?